Welcome to In the News, Conversations Around Security, a new and dynamic podcast where we dissect the day's headlines through the critical lens of security risk management and where awareness meets analysis. Join us on the 1st and 15th of each month as we bring you a fresh episode packed with informative debates, expert analysis, and thought-provoking insights offering a nuanced perspective on the stories that shape our world. So buckle up and join us for a look at what's in the news, conversations around security. Hello, folks, and thanks for joining us for part two of our two-part series on Hamas with special guest Phil Gurski, formerly of CSIS, and now the president and owner of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. And without much further ado, let's get into the part two.
But when your own government seems to ignore intelligence and isn't ponying up, we heard the Trudeau government announce it has no intention of meeting the NATO 2% standard for defense spending. People begin to wonder, is Canada in for a free ride? Is it not pulling its weight? So it does have serious implications for Canada.
If you were a conspiracy-minded thinker, and I'm far from that, but you can't help but think that these guys are either completely stupid or they're working for the bad guy. I mean, the Pollyanna world that some of our politicians live in, okay, and the fact that they refuse to accept the reality of what we see every night on TV is troubling. It's downright scary.
You use the word Pollyanna. I would agree with that, Luke. I think we've got people who see the world as they want to see it. The world's a nasty place. It always has been, and it always will be. And if you don't accept that because it doesn't fit with your worldview, or you prefer things to be better, I mean, didn't Trudeau talk about Canada being the world's first post nation state or something?
Yeah.
Whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, I have no idea. But to get back, Brian, to your question on the Palestinians. Yeah, it does worry me. So, the way that it works, what worked when I was at CSIS, CSIS has a role in security screening for immigrants from certain parts of the world. And that's not mince words here. We're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about parts of Asia. CSIS has the authority to look into people's backgrounds to determine if, in fact, there's something there which would preclude them being good Canadian citizens. The problem is CSIS doesn't make the decision. They pass their information on to Citizenship Immigration Canada, who make the decision. They can, and again, in the lack of an intelligence culture, they can ignore the CSIS intelligence. So we've had Islamist terrorists come into our country, and we've tried to deport them, and they're here 25 years later. They're still here, and they're suing us for 10.5 million, which seems to be, by the way, the going rate for suing the Canadian government is 10.5 million. So again, we've got intelligence agencies doing their best to warn the government, to provide information to make better decisions, and that intelligence doesn't go anywhere in many cases, and we end up with the problems that we're going to have.
But I just wanted to clarify one thing there, Phil, because oftentimes we talk about people coming into the country and we lump them into the same group. Is it fair to say, like, immigrants are not refugees, which is, I think, what we're really looking at right with the current situation? It's refugees. So there's a different dynamic there. I don't think they're necessarily coming here to be part of the fabric and contribute to in terms of work and a new life. They don't really have a choice. They're escaping their situation. Does CSIS change the way they do those background checks for refugees versus an immigrant? Are they even involved with immigrants? Is that a separate channel?
That I don't know. I know the security screening branch is the largest operational branch that CSIS has. And the security screening branch looks at things like people seeking security clearances here in Canada, as well as certain immigrants. I don't know that we make a distinction between immigrants and refugees. That's a really good question. But to me, it doesn't matter. If you're coming to Canada from an area of the world that is known to be one where extremism happens on a regular basis, any country, any sane country, any wise country would want to do a very detailed background check to ensure that the people who come, and let's face it, 99.9% will come here for all the right reasons. They're fleeing war, they're fleeing famine, they're fleeing persecution, whatever. And Canada is friendly to immigration. I personally am pro-immigration. I mean, shit, all of us are the sons or grandsons of immigrants, right? I'm third generation Eastern European Canadian. Okay, so for me to be anti-immigrant would be counterintuitive. I mean, my grandparents couldn't have come here during the First World War, but not all immigrants come here for the right reasons. And I think that's why you have a security service that does the screening that it does. So, saying that people should be put through a process is not the same as someone who says, well, you're just being a racist or anti-immigrant. No, you're doing your due diligence as a security service to determine that, to make sure that people with agendas or people with certain ideologies that are inimical to Canada's interests are not allowed to come to the country.
So here's the reality. There's a shit show going on in the Middle East right now. There's real violence, there's real carnage happening. You talked about terrorism threats in the West, in Europe, places like that. Canada's not immune. Hamas, let me ask you, Hamas operates in Canada?
I have no doubt that they do, certainly from a financing perspective. Let's also remind your listeners that it was a week ago that the RCMP in Ottawa arrested a couple of young offenders planning an act of terrorism somewhere in Ottawa. Now, interestingly, the news didn't mention the nature of the violence, but I did a bit of digging myself. And let's put it this way, guys, these sure as shit weren't right-wing terrorists or lefties. These are Islamist extremists. Now, were they linked to ISIS? Because we have a lot of ISIS-inspired people around the world still. The Brits just made another arrest about an ISIS-inspired person in the UK just the other day. Or were they Hamas linked or sympathetic? I have no idea. But we have people that the RCMP has arrested out west in Calgary. We've had people in Ottawa arrested who are tied to this Islamist extremist ideology, and they were going to target Jewish institutions. Now, to me, that suggests these are people who want to seek revenge for what's happening in Gaza by attacking what they see to be the problem, i.e., synagogues or Jewish centers, somehow making the equation that the state of Israel and a Jewish synagogue in Ottawa are one and the same. I don't know how you get there personally, because lots of Jewish Canadians are very angry at what Israel is doing in the West Bank as well. But these people don't, they're not rocket scientists, right? They don't have two neurons to rub together. They just see an easy target. So yes, Hamas has a presence here in Canada. Of that I have no doubt.
So again, bringing back the nexus to security, as a security practitioner, I'm faced with, Luke and my colleagues are faced with, how do we manage these protests? How do we manage the violence that we're seeing at the Eaton Center and other big public private venues? It's been noticeable the way the two sides demonstrate are different.
Yeah.
There's a lot of disruption on the pro-Palestinian side, and it's a bit of a love-in on the Israeli side.
Yeah.
Is that a cultural thing, or is that being pushed somehow by
Yeah,
entities?
It's a great question. Look, we all agree that under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you have a right to protest. You have a right to register your political opinion. You have your right to disagree with the government or any other government for that matter. But the protests have to be peaceful. They can't engage in violence. They can't engage in intimidation. They can't threaten anybody. And what we're certainly seeing on the Palestinian side are people who either A, do not see Hamas as a terrorist organization, or are simply so angry and saddened by what they see happening in Gaza that they lose their shit. Now, and I get that, right? Again, you can't see that footage and not become emotionally involved in it, whether you're Palestinian or not. But we have protests in Toronto where people are threatening police officers. And nothing's done about it. Now, I mean, the police are in a difficult situation here, right? If they were to make efforts to arrest somebody who would threaten a police officer, can you imagine the ensuing shit show when everybody else starts ganging up on the police as well? So, I mean, this is not a happy day for Toronto Police Services either. I don't know that it's a cultural thing. I just find now that because public opinion has swayed so heavily in favor of the Palestinians in Gaza, that as a consequence, that's where the demonstrations are going. And people have forgotten what happened on October 7th. As I keep reminding everybody, Israel would not be in Gaza had it not been for October the 7th. They're not there for shits and giggles. They're not there because they want to be. They got out in 2005 because they realized there was no point in being there anymore. People are ignoring, deliberately ignoring why this war is taking place in Gaza. And it's taking place because Hamas killed 1,200 people. And as you said, Luke, took 240 people hostages. So that's the calculus you have to bring this back to. And if you don't do that, you're being dishonest and you're simply hiding the facts.
And I think the scary thing is that we have a lot of people are getting frustrated. You talked about the way the police are handling it, and I understand they're between a rock and a hard place. I understand that they've got to say, "Look, you've broken the law, but if we arrest you now, we're going to make a bad situation worse. We'll come for you later." I get that, but people are getting frustrated. What I'm seeing, on social media, people that were sort of centrist, there's this move now to the right. There's this anti-immigrant thing. There's this. It is ridiculous, and I'm just sort of scared that we're starting down a path that we will not easily come back out of.
That's a really good point. And you raised something which I think a lot of people have expressed concern about over the past 4 or 5 years, and that's what I would call the re-rise of the far right. Now look at, the far right in Canada, when I worked at CSIS, and I worked here until 2015, the far right couldn't organize a piss up in a bar. This is why CSIS was on the verge of actually downing its far right investigative team. There was nothing to look at. There was nobody that of any concern. That obviously has changed. But again, I would caution jihadis still carry out 99.9% attacks around the world, whether it's Hamas or ISIS or Al Qaeda or Al Shabaab, whatever kind of thing. But you're right, Brian. There has been, I think, a concomitant rise in anti-immigrant feeling, partly because we see people like Adel Sharkawi in Montreal, whom we tried to deport back in 2002, who got his citizenship despite the fact that CSIS had told courts that had reliable intelligence that he was an Islamist extremist. Now he's spouting hate from a mosque in Montreal, calling for the destruction of Israel. We gave him his citizenship. He's suing us for 27.5 million, so more than 10.5 million in this case. And people have become frustrated. People have become frustrated that people are basically being allowed in the country and engaged in activities. And I'm not going to say they're un-Canadian, because we can differ on what Canadian means. But we can certainly agree that people who are espousing violence in our lands against people here in Canada or abroad, that's not what Canada stands for. And when they see these demonstrations taking place, and you're also seeing a really bizarre marriage between the far left and the Hamas supporters.
Yes.
Whether it's Greta Thunberg in Norway calling for an independent Palestine. It's a really bizarre. And I wrote a column on this recently. Here these far left groups see Hamas as these resistance fighters. Hamas are the most misogynist group. All Islamist extremist groups are misogynist.
They care about the environment.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. But I mean, have you heard the accounts of rape that Hamas engaged in October the 7th? And yet people are, no pun intended, jumping into bed with them kind of thing. Yeah, and then people are reacting. And I think it's part and parcel. In a way, it's kind of a reflection of sort of the anti-woke, anti-cancer culture that you're seeing rise of late. People are sick and tired of being told what to do, how to think, changing street names, changing Yonge and Dundas Square to something in Ghanaian. It goes on and on and on. And I think average Canadians, and I would say average centrist Canadians, Brian, not necessarily right-wing Canadians, because I consider myself a centrist, are just fed up.
Yeah.
They're fed up with this dialogue. They're fed up with this narrative, and being told that you're because of who you are, you're by definition systemically racist. Because I happen to be a white guy, and I happen to be male.
No, sorry, Luke, I just want to jump in very quickly, briefly. Yeah. If you look at history, if you look at the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, if you look at how Hitler came to power, if you look at Mussolini, if you look at fascist regimes, I'm just fearful that we're going on that trajectory, and the mass hysteria is going to be hard to come back from. But Luke, I stole your thunder.
No, it's actually that's the same road I was gonna go down with Phil. What I'm seeing and what I'm worried about really is that you see a conflating of different interests and using that Gaza incident and the war to stimulate and make these interests come together and basically take it into another direction. And what that looks like, I don't know, but it's looking pretty ugly in Europe right now in terms of, it's not just about Gaza, it's about Islamicism against the Catholics and all, and it's a lot bigger discussion than I think we're really being led on to believe. Right. Certainly in Canada, our press really doesn't talk about that. It talks just about Gaza and Israel.
I'm actually cautiously optimistic on that front, guys. There's been all these predictions about a massive rise in the far right and violence, and I'm not seeing it. I mean, I keep track of terrorism on a daily basis, and I'm not seeing the types of attacks that people have said are inevitable. Yes, there have been instances. You saw what happened in Christchurch. You saw what happened in Quebec City in 2017. We're not seeing the volume. We're not seeing the levels that people have been predicting for quite some time. And yes, there are some problematic right-wing governments. We have Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's a real asshole. We have Giorgia Meloni in Italy, but she's a lot less strident than people thought she would be when she became the prime minister of Italy. Geert Wilders was just elected the top party in the Netherlands. He's a real piece of work. But I just, maybe I'm being naive, but right now I don't see the ingredients necessary to lead to extreme, as you call it, Brian, sort of the rise of fascism in far right groups that we saw in the 20s and 30s, a rise in Europe. I hope I'm right. I'll continue to monitor this very carefully as time goes on, and if it does start to change, I'll start to take note of it. But it's not there yet, and I don't know. I mean, politics is pendulum. We're going to get a right-wing government in Canada probably in 2025, given the way the polls are showing right now. This government ran out of ideas a long time ago. And whatever you think of Trudeau, I don't really care. All governments have a shelf life, and this government's shelf life ended years ago. I think Canadians will vote for change, and that change will likely be the Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre. What he stands for is what he stands for. What kind of government he rules, you know, guys, historically, governments always tend to move to the center anyhow, because that's where they have to
Yeah.
govern from.
Yeah.
A lot of their ideas, being as Pollyannish as they might be, they don't fly, they don't work, and so you've got to basically change in order to survive, kind of thing. So, I don't lose sleep over the far right. Again, you know, I track terrorism, as I said, and I'm just not seeing it just yet. And I hope it continues that way.
But do you see like some of the decisions that our government's made? It's obviously stemmed some of those fires on both sides of the argument. And my question would be like, doesn't hesitation or unclear directives from a government
Yeah.
sort of encourage people who might sympathize with certain causes here to say, hey, these guys, I mean, they're not really calling the Jews that bad. Or they're really bad. It's not Hamas ain't
Yeah.
all that bad. Maybe I should step
Yeah.
up and do something.
I think you're right. I mean, this government has said it wants a 500,000
Yeah.
per year immigrant goal to achieve. That's a lot of people. And you know, again, I'm definitely pro-immigration, but who's going to screen those 500,000 people? And where we're going to take them from? And yeah, you know, people, Canada's obviously changed. Look at the Canada of 2023 is not the Canada of 1960 when I was born. It was a much more white society back then. All of my friends were either Dutch immigrants or Portuguese or Italian, or in my case, Eastern European. We were all pretty well the same kind of thing, right? That's obviously changed over the past 66 odd years. And some would say that's a good change, and some would say it's bad, and some would say it's neutral kind of thing. But yeah, I do worry that when you have a government that gives mixed messages on that thing, that it does encourage a polarization of society, both on the left
Mhm.
and on the right. And that's never a good thing. You want a government to bring people together, not split people apart.
So, you know, to bring this back, we were talking sort of at a strategic level, geopolitical level, to bring it back to day to day in Toronto as a security consultant, security practitioner, there's very little that I can tell my clients they can do other than guns, guards, and gates. But we're just along for the ride, the private sector, the the
Yeah.
people from the Eaton Center and run the path and run all the sport venues and the theaters. We just have to rely on our political leaders to do the right thing. And whatever they do, we have to clean up the mess. Would you agree, Phil, or are there things that we could be doing that we're not?
We obviously want an open and free society. Like I said, we want people to feel safe when they're going to public venues. We don't want, you know, bomb scares. We don't want people with guns going through our malls, etc. We want to be able to shop at the Eaton Center without having to go through 1,000 or 10,000 strong protests in favor of Palestine and Hamas. As a Canadian, I have that right to not have someone push me around or shove a megaphone in my face and start yelling at me, kind of thing. There must be laws or municipal bylaws on sizes of crowds and when they can gather and for how long they can gather. But again, and we talked about it before, Brian, the problem is that, you know, once these people show up, you've got an immediate problem. Even if that particular crowd is illegal under some kind of bylaw, are you going to try and make the effort to disperse it
Yeah.
when tensions are high and emotions are boiling over? Not really. So I don't know what it is we can actually do, but yeah, the mixed messages from the government are not helping. I mean, you know, Hamas thanked the Trudeau government for calling for a
Yeah.
ceasefire. Yeah,
Yes.
and I'm thinking that was a shitty day in Liberal cabinet when a listed terrorist entity says, by the way, Mr. Trudeau, thank you for your support. And you notice how quickly the Liberals backtracked on that one. They couldn't move, you know, more. I've never seen a government move that quickly to distance themselves from getting a thank you card from the leader of Hamas. But I do think that private security agencies are placed in a very difficult position because they've got limited use of force within their, you know, their structures, and they don't want to make matters worse. But you know, if the average Canadian can't go to a Zara store or can't go to the Eaton Center and shop for fear they're not going to get through the door, or I mean, can you imagine you've got your kids or your grandkids in tow, and you're hearing these people yelling and swearing and all kinds of stuff? And what's it doing to
Like,
businesses that are fearful to open because, you know, they might get swarmed? And let's
yeah,
face it too, guys, you know, criminal elements are going to take advantage of this as well.
Of
I think it
course.
was a huge Palestinian demonstration at the Eaton Center. You don't think your average, you know, crook is going to, you know, try to do some shoplifting or whatever kind of thing? Absolutely. They're going to see what's happening and say, hey, that's an opportunity for me at the same time.
I thought of it reminds me of this poor, well, it just happened on the weekend in Dundas Square with the Canadian police officer with the Canadian flag being flown in his face. And maybe, he could have handled it a little better. But to me, it was just everything that's ugly about the situation where, to your point, he doesn't want to get involved. That guy with the Canadian flag is just, he's agitating. Even though I'm a Canadian, you wanted to support it. You know what he's there for? He's to agitate the crowd. And the officer's trying to tell me, take it somewhere else. We don't need that stuff here. But it looks like, well, Canada's sort of taking secondary precedence over, their interests. And it's totally bad for the media and the looks it gives to the Canadians. So I totally empathize with the position that police are put in.
Absolutely. And again, your job is not to let things to escalate, but again, at what point do we start taking back our public spaces?
Good.
No, I was going to say, I don't get out a lot, right? I'm at that point now. I'm not big into shopping anyhow. And, I live in a small village now. I don't go to Ottawa that often. And, I don't want to be in crowds anyhow. But like I said, you think of the average family going out for dinner one night or something, or to a McDonald's in a mall, and to have to, witness this kind of thing. Of course, people are getting angry. And the unfortunate part is that a very, very small number of people will get angry and will do something about it. Now, I'm not talking about, using extreme violence and killing somebody, but they're gonna get their face in the faces of the demonstrators, and they're gonna provoke arguments and maybe, provoke fisticuffs, whatever kind of thing, because people are just fed up and they're not gonna take it anymore.
It really is amazing, that I think what makes a democracy and our democracies work is that people can express their beliefs without fear of reprisal and demonstrate. And I'm amazed, not amazed, I'm really excited or proud when I see, there's a protest of some sort, be it a labor union or whatever, and they get away with so much because we want to give them the opportunity to express. That's what a democracy is, and that's what Canada is. But the thing that a lot of people are having trouble understanding is the rights of the majority. They have rights also. They can go to the Eaton Center and sit on Santa Claus lap, like our leaders are doing a terrible job sort of making sure that everyone's rights are being protected, not just the ones that talk the loudest.
I think it's a good point. And the way that I've heard it expressed is it's all about votes.
Yeah.
So if a certain riding in Toronto is, I don't know, I'll make up something, primarily Palestinian or primarily Jewish or primarily whatever kind of thing. Let's face it, politicians are smarmy bastards at the best of times, and they're going to do and say whatever is necessary to get votes in that area. Why is it Canada doesn't use the word Sikh extremism? Because they know a shit ton of ridings in southwestern British Columbia, in Surrey, in Burnaby, and parts of Toronto are heavily Sikh dominated. And if they start talking about Sikh terrorism, they won't get those votes from those people in the upcoming elections. So they use weasel words to get around it, kind of thing. Like South Asian terrorism. We're talking about fucking Laos or something. You got to call things what they are. But because politicians, at the end of the day, all they want to do is get reelected, they're not stupid, and they do and say things that are going to ensure that they get back into office. And as a consequence, they don't take those brave stands. And I think you're seeing a government now that has failed miserably in taking principled stands on these types of things.
So basically, you're saying we're screwed.
But no, the shining, I guess the silver lining here, guys, is that, as I wrote in the Peaceable Kingdom, if you take the broadest definition of terrorism possible, and obviously I focus on terrorism because that's what I did in counterterrorism. We've had maybe 20 attacks in 155 years. So, 20 attacks, that's a good week in Somalia or parts of, the Sahel part of Africa. So I don't really worry about this escalating to the point where we're going to become like a failed state kind of thing. It's not to say we won't have more attacks. Of course we will, because that's just the nature of terrorism. But eventually this war will wind down in Gaza, probably much before Netanyahu wants it to, because of international and, let's face it, U.S. pressure as Israel's main ally. We'll go back to the status quo ante. Hamas will not be destroyed. They'll gear up for more arms. They'll gear up for another attack. Maybe not on the scale of October the 7th, but whatever kind of thing. And like I said, we'll be having the same conversation a year from now or 2 years from now, if we're all in the same business still, because it's going to be like, what goes around comes around. It's like deja vu all over again, right? But no, I tend to be more of an optimistic person. There's a great book that came out many years ago by a Canadian actually named Steven Pinker. He's a linguist, so I was a linguist for years, but he's also more like kind of like a philosopher. And he wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. He looked at violence throughout human history. And of course, it's hard to get statistics for 10,000 years ago. But when you look at kind of the general narrative about how people died over time, you had a 1 in 10 chance of dying violently in the Middle Ages. There were wars, there was no police, banditry, criminality. Right now, in countries like Canada, you have like a 1 in a gazillion chance of dying in violence. That's the message I want to take away from this, is that as angry as people are, and as emotional as they're getting over this, the vast majority of people aren't going to do anything stupid about it and act violently. So that's kind of allows me to sleep at night, I suppose, knowing that it's still going to be a fairly rare response to a very tenuous situation.
That's sort of a good way to wrap this up, Luke, don't you think?
Yeah, that's a
On a
great.
good note.
It is
On
a
a
good
good
note.
note.
It's a great way to sum it all up. For myself personally, I mean, I always enjoy your points of view, Phil, whether with
Thanks,
talking
Luke.
to us or on TV, especially. Trying to educate our media in terms of what's actually going on in the world around us. It's not all bunnies and rainbows. Certainly not in Canada, even though we might think that often. But I appreciate you coming on today and giving us your insights. Your extensive experience speaks volumes to your perspective, and there's a lot of credibility behind that when you say
Well,
something.
thanks.
So I appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Brian.
Phil, you represent your craft really, really well. You speak well. You're really smart guy. You're a fair guy. I love reading your daily blog posts, I think daily, and you do great work. Can you just tell our listeners where they can find it online? Because I think it's well worth the
Sure.
read to subscribe.
Well, thanks, Luke and Brian, for the feedback. I really appreciate it. It's nice to know that the message is resonating with some people, and I won't be getting hate mail from either of you two. At least not. I hope not. So the website is borealisthreatandrisk.com. That's where all the podcasts and blogs are. There's no subscription fee. It's all free of charge. And I'll just add a teaser alert. I'm starting 2 new series. Starting in January. They're probably going to be weekly or not bi-weekly. I'm not going to give too many details right now, but they're going to be in-depth looks at terrorism. Again, use the term educate, Luke. That's what I'm trying to do. Is I don't have all the answers. I spent 32 years in Intel, and I had access to some incredibly sensitive information, which I try to understand and interpret for decision makers. But there's a lot of data out there that's getting ignored. And that's what worries me, is that people are simply refusing to acknowledge what's really happening. So these 2 new series are going to take a look at real data and what its implications are for how we think about terrorism, what we do about terrorism, and things like that. So I'm also, if you want to follow me on Twitter, is @BorealisSaves, which is actually a bit of a takeoff on the fact that I'm a really shitty goaltender and pick up hockey. But I'm also on Facebook and on LinkedIn. But more people that want to reach out and have a chat about all things national security and public safety, be happy to engage them.
And I must say, just before I end my piece, is some time ago when we were talking, we talked about experts and expert witnesses in court and things like that. And I always like to call myself, in the past, before we had this discussion, a security risk management expert. But if you're not calling yourself an expert, I can't call myself an expert. So if you ever change your mind, let me know, please.
I will. The only reason I do that, guys, is that the term is so overused, and when I see people in the media refer to themselves or being referred to as an expert, I kind of just cringe. So I ask people not to call me that. And I had a great line. I had a woman called Martha Crenshaw on my podcast about a month ago. She's an academic in the States. She's in Alabama. She was one of the first professors to look at terrorism in the 1960s. Like, she's been around forever. And she says, I don't know if you ever heard of a man called Thomas Friedman, who was a New York Times reporter for many, many, many years. And in the wake of 9/11, he used to joke that if he ever was watching the news and the news anchor said, "And now for a look on terrorism, we have expert so and so," Thomas Friedman said, at that point, I turned to the Golf Channel, because he was sick and tired of hearing yet another expert waiting on something. So I'm sorry, Brian, that I precluded you calling yourself an expert. Call yourself whatever the hell you want. It's a free country.
I call them all kinds of things.
No, I'm sure you do.
Thanks a lot, Phil, for joining us.
Yeah.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And to our listeners, as always, please leave your comments, like and subscribe to our channel. We're happy to answer those questions and move forward with more content, more guests like Phil, to bring it to you, in virtual reality. But until next time, stay safe, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye, everyone.